The case of Dorothy Stratton. Dorothy Ruth Stratton was born on February 28, 1960, in a neighborhood in Vancouver. Her parents were of Dutch descent and had moved to Canada a year after her birth. The Stratton family later grew with the arrival of a son named John, and 7 years afterward, Dorothy gained a younger sister named Louise. Her family led a simple life. Dorothy was a diligent student. During her childhood, she did not dream of fame or aspire to a distinguished career. She only wished for the basic things her poor family could not provide. In 1977, Dorothy began working at a fast food restaurant called Dairy Queen while still attending high school. At that time, she was 17 years old, with blonde hair, a charming face, and a tall figure that attracted considerable attention. Not only young boys but also older, affluent men were drawn to her beauty. One evening, shortly before the diner closed, Paul Snyder, a charming young man, entered Dorothy's workplace. Paul was immediately attracted to the young and beautiful Dorothy. After placing his order and paying, Paul handed her a large bill. When Dorothy said she could not provide him with change, Paul laughed and offered her the money on the condition that she go on a date with him immediately. Dorothy agreed. Paul Snyder, 26, was a prominent figure in Vancouver. He managed and scouted models for clubs and had many friends and connections throughout Canada. When Paul saw 17-year-old Dorothy with her blonde hair and charming smile, he immediately recognized her potential. Paul asked Dorothy on a date to a fancy restaurant and gifted her a red evening gown, which she later wore to her high school prom. Paul and Dorothy began a relationship. Although Paul was 9 years older than she was, her parents did not object to their relationship. A few months into their relationship, Paul persuaded Dorothy to participate in a daring photo shoot, and she initially felt uncomfortable. Paul convinced her that she had the talent to become a successful model and earn a substantial income. Dorothy eventually agreed to his proposal. Paul secured a studio and hired a professional photographer to take pictures of Dorothy. After completing the photo shoot, he sent the images to the well-known Playboy magazine. Dorothy's photos made a strong impression, and a Playboy editor invited her to Los Angeles. However, Paul knew Dorothy's parents would not approve of her working for such a provocative magazine, so he forged her mother's signature, claiming she had given permission for Dorothy to sign a contract with the magazine. In the summer of 1979, Paul and Dorothy traveled to Hollywood. By August, Dorothy had become Playboy's Playmate of the Month and began working as a bunny at the Playboy Club. However, she felt pressured by the attention and was unaccustomed to her new role. She also found it unsettling that wealthy men were infatuated with her and spent time with her. Paul Snyder was constantly by her side, managing every aspect of Dorothy's life, from scheduling to signing contracts. Yet she also felt completely controlled by Paul. To solidify their relationship, Paul proposed marriage, and Dorothy finally accepted after some consideration. She agreed because she felt indebted to him for all he had done for her. In Dorothy's view, if it were not for Paul, she might still be a waitress living on tips. She always believed that without him, her life would have been monotonous working at the diner. However, Dorothy's family doubted her decision, suspecting that Paul was exploiting her for profit. They warned her against marrying him. In 1979, the same year Paul proposed, they held a modest wedding in Las Vegas. After their simple wedding, Paul and Dorothy continued diligently pursuing their careers. Dorothy also began acting, earning recognition from directors not only for her beauty and charm, but also for her genuine acting talent. As Dorothy's fame and fortune increased, she used her earnings to purchase a spacious home in Los Angeles, where she lived with her husband. Paul Snyder took pride in his wife's accomplishments, often boasting to friends that Dorothy's rising fame was a shared achievement. As Dorothy's manager, Paul was constantly present at her photo shoots and events, overseeing their finances and assets. He also closely monitored her diet, clothing choices, and alcohol consumption at social gatherings, occasionally advising her on which influential people to associate with to further her career. There was considerable speculation that Dorothy had an affair with Hugh Hefner, the editor-in-chief of Playboy magazine. However, Hugh denied the claims, asserting that Dorothy was not a woman of loose morals. Over time, Dorothy began to recognize that her husband Paul was exerting excessive control over her life. She appointed a new professional manager and started excluding her husband from photo shoots, using various excuses. The distance between the couple widened, and sensing this, Paul's mental state deteriorated. He became jealously protective of his wife, even hiring a private investigator to monitor her activities. Yet no evidence of wrongdoing was ever produced. Paul imposed restrictions on Dorothy's clothing, forbidding her from wearing provocative attire, and prevented men who did not benefit the family financially from admiring her. He instigated conflicts and, in moments of anger, even resorted to physical violence. Dorothy found it increasingly impossible to tolerate her husband's aggressive outbursts and sought to distance herself from him. Friends and colleagues noticed the growing tension in Paul and Dorothy's marriage. Playboy staff frequently advised her to end her relationship with him. While Dorothy was occupied with photo shoots, Paul remained at home, living off his wife's earnings and indulging in idleness. One day, he discovered that Dorothy had established a company in her own name and was actively investing in it. This action, advised by her manager, was strategically designed so that, in the event of a divorce, Paul Snyder would have no claim to the money. Paul's behavior escalated further as he sought to reassert control over his wife. As Dorothy rarely returned home, Paul began to realize that his influence over what he considered his golden ticket was slipping away. In the spring of 1980, at a gathering at the Playboy Mansion, 20-year-old Dorothy met 40-year-old film director Peter Bogdanovich, a close associate of Hugh Hefner. Peter was charmed by Dorothy and invited her to star in his upcoming comedy. Everyone laughed, and Dorothy accepted the offer to play a mistress. On March 22nd, Dorothy traveled alone to New York to shoot the comedy. She lied to Paul, telling him that the director had forbidden anyone other than the cast and crew from being on the set, as she feared Paul might cause a disturbance during filming. Furthermore, Dorothy asked her manager to screen calls from her domineering husband while she was on set. In New York, Dorothy became infatuated with Peter, and a passionate affair developed between the actress and the director. Dorothy felt joy in being with someone new in her life, eager not to miss the opportunity with a sophisticated, wealthy, and influential director. Her attitude toward her husband grew distant and cold. Dorothy spent 2 months in New York, leaving Paul alone in their large Los Angeles home. Occasionally, Paul brought other women home, who were shocked to discover he was being unfaithful to such a beautiful wife, a Playboy model. In April 1980, Dorothy returned to California to attend the Playboy Awards. She won the prestigious title of Model of the Year and appeared on the magazine's cover, earning a new accolade. As part of her recognition, she received a lavish gift from Playboy, a Jaguar sports car, and a cash prize of $200,000. She also developed a close friendship with Hugh Hefner, who held high hopes for her. After the ceremony, Dorothy embarked on a 2-week promotional tour across Canada. During the weekend, she attended a party with director Peter. Meanwhile, she had planned to spend the final portion of the tour with her family in Vancouver. However, Paul discovered her plans and immediately traveled to Vancouver, where he leveraged his experience managing clubs and his extensive connections. During Dorothy's brief break, Paul coerced her into working in clubs and retained all the profits. This period caused a major conflict between the couple. Dorothy was in tears, contemplating abandoning her career to save the marriage. She expressed a desire to return to her parents' home with Paul and begin a new life. Paul dismissed the notion. After the tour in Canada, Dorothy returned to New York to continue filming while avoiding her husband. At one point, she called Paul and requested some space in their relationship. Paul became depressed and angry with Dorothy. At the time, he was engaged in an affair with a girl under the age of 18. The girl resembled a model, and Paul intended to transform her into the next Playboy bunny. However, he soon realized that his young lover could never surpass his wife. In June 1980, on their first wedding anniversary, Paul received a distressing letter from Dorothy expressing her desire for a divorce and her intention to cease financial support for him. This convinced Paul that his fears of Dorothy's infidelity were justified, particularly as he suspected she was involved with director Peter Bogdanovich. To gather evidence of his wife's alleged betrayal, Paul hired a private investigator. On one occasion, he called Dorothy's manager and threatened to cause trouble or even commit a more serious act. The manager advised Dorothy to hire bodyguards and remain cautious around Paul. However, Dorothy ignored this advice. Lacking a green card and permanent residency in the United States, Paul struggled with employment and financial stability. Facing the risk of exhausting his funds, he withdrew all money from his and Dorothy's joint bank account. Consequently, he also sold Dorothy's valuable possessions, including collectibles, jewelry, and the Jaguar sports car gifted by Playboy, all at low prices and only for cash. Additionally, he began renting out rooms in their large house to friends, partly due to depression and loneliness. Gradually, Paul considered returning to his native Canada. In mid-July, filming for Dorothy's movie was completed. Following this, Dorothy and Peter Bogdanovich took a 10-day vacation to England. Upon returning to Los Angeles on July 30th, Dorothy decided to move into the director's mansion in the affluent Bel Air neighborhood. Meanwhile, Dorothy's ex-husband Paul was plotting revenge. On the afternoon of July 31st, he borrowed a gun and went to Peter Bogdanovich's house that night. He hid near the gates of the mansion, determined to shoot anyone who approached. After hours of fruitless waiting, Paul grew desperate and drove to a mountainous area overlooking Los Angeles. While alone there, he was tormented by painful thoughts of suicide. When he returned home late that night, he still clung to hopes of reconciling with Dorothy. A week later, on August 8th, he persuaded Dorothy to meet him at his house. However, Dorothy had changed significantly since their separation. She had become a confident woman with newfound charm and was no longer influenced by Paul's words. Dorothy informed Paul that she was in love with another man and wanted a divorce. Paul remained composed and asked her to return in a week to discuss the separation amicably. However, the following day, Paul attempted to purchase a gun. He visited several stores, but was unable to buy one because he was a Canadian citizen. Paul then asked his private investigator to acquire a rifle for self-defense and home security, but the investigator advised against it and refused to help. On August 11th, Paul found a newspaper ad for an old 12-gauge shotgun for sale. He decided to travel to the San Fernando Valley to inspect it and possibly make the purchase. However, he became lost and could not locate the address, so he returned home without the shotgun. 2 days later, on August 13th, Paul returned to the same location, found the seller, and purchased the old shotgun, telling the seller he intended to use it for hunting. On August 14th, Paul asked his roommate to leave the house so he could speak with his wife, Dorothy, privately and without interruption. Dorothy's managers and assistants advised her to bring someone with her or handle the discussion over the phone. Nevertheless, Dorothy chose to go alone. She brought a large sum of money to express her gratitude to Paul for his past assistance and hoped the meeting would be peaceful so that they could maintain a friendly relationship. Dorothy intended for the meeting with Paul to be brief, scheduling a photo shoot for later that evening. At noon on August 14th, she went to meet Paul at his home. Upon arrival, Dorothy received a safety check call from her manager, who had previously set up a specific code for her to use if she encountered any problems. After assuring the manager that everything was fine, the call ended. However, the conversation between Dorothy and Paul gradually became tense and escalated into an argument. In a sudden fit of rage, Paul pulled out a gun and shot Dorothy in the face. After killing Dorothy, Paul appeared to lose control of himself and behaved erratically. He ultimately took his own life. At 8 p.m., Dorothy's roommates returned home and saw her car parked in front of the house. Upon entering, they noticed Dorothy's handbag in the living room and assumed that Paul and Dorothy had reconciled. Believing the couple was in the bedroom, the roommates retreated to their own room and remained quiet. Dorothy's managers grew increasingly concerned when they could not reach her by phone. They eventually contacted Paul and Dorothy's roommate at 11 p.m. After a brief conversation, the roommates decided to check the master bedroom. Upon entering, they were confronted with a horrifying scene. Both Dorothy and Paul were dead. According to the autopsy, 20-year-old Dorothy Stratton died approximately 1 hour after arriving home. Paul died about an hour following his wife's death. Hugh Hefner was among the first to be informed of the tragedy. He called his friend Peter Bogdanovich to deliver the news of Dorothy's death. Upon hearing the news, Peter was so shocked that he fainted and subsequently relied on sedatives for an extended period to cope with his grief. As a result, Playboy magazine went to publication before the editors were aware of the tragedy, and the August cover was not changed. Consequently, the magazine was released featuring a photograph of Dorothy Stratton, who had tragically passed away. However, for the annual Playboy issue, Dorothy's image was replaced with that of another model. Peter Bogdanovich took responsibility for organizing and financing Dorothy Stratton's funeral. The loss of his lover had a profound effect on him. He chose to have her remains cremated, and they were subsequently interred in a Los Angeles cemetery. After the tragic death of the model, the film studio decided not to release They All Laughed, the comedy in which Dorothy had starred. Determined to ensure the film reached audiences, Peter purchased the rights with his own money. The comedy, They All Laughed, was eventually released in 1981. Despite his efforts, the film received little critical acclaim and failed to attract a large audience. This commercial failure cost Peter millions of dollars and ultimately contributed to his bankruptcy. Several years after Dorothy Stratton's death, rumors emerged that director Peter Bogdanovich had secretly met with Dorothy's younger sister, Louise Stratton, who was then 13 years old. The Stratton family strongly denied the claims and took legal action to prevent the spread of these rumors. However, in 1988, 8 years later, Peter, then 49, married Louise Stratton, who was 20 at the time. Louise later stated in interviews that their romance had begun when she was 18. Peter Bogdanovich and Louise Stratton remained married for 13 years before divorcing in 2001. Peter never remarried, dedicating the remainder of his life to filmmaking. He passed away in 2022 at the age of 82. Louise Stratton, now residing in her hometown of Vancouver, pursued a career as an actress and film director. Moving on to the next case. The case of Judy or Baldwin. Judy or Baldwin, who was born on January 12, 1963, in Chester, South Carolina, was the child of Robert and Annie Floyd Smith McQuarters. After finishing her education at Chester Christian School, Judy launched her own business, known as Judy's Personal Touch. She was also affiliated with Woodward Baptist Church and was actively involved in the Women's Missionary Union. In 1981, Judy wed Wallace Todd Footor. They welcomed 2 children before Wallace sadly died in 2004 as a result of a motorcycle accident. In 2012, Judy met James Jamie Harold Baldwin, and only 8 months later, the two were married. Judy's relatives and close friends remembered that she appeared to be deeply in love with Jamie. They felt relieved that she was able to move forward after losing her first husband and find joy once more. However, on the night of December 14, 2016, a devastating tragedy occurred in Chester County, South Carolina. Judy was discovered deceased following a serious automobile crash. Her husband, James, called for assistance, and when law enforcement arrived at the location, they confirmed that Judy had died. James stated that earlier that night, Judy had been decorating the Christmas tree when she suddenly fell from a ladder and hit her head on the fireplace. He claimed he attempted to stop the bleeding and then carried her to the passenger seat of his Jeep, planning to drive her to Piedmont Medical Center. However, while traveling, James said he lost control of the vehicle while swerving to avoid an oncoming truck, which caused the Jeep to run off an embankment. He was briefly unconscious. When he came to, Judy was no longer inside the vehicle. He then located her body in front of the Jeep, appearing to have been thrown from the vehicle during the crash. When officers examined James's home, they found a ladder that had been knocked over and blood near the Christmas tree. To them, the physical evidence appeared to support James's version of events. Authorities closed the case, ruling it an accident. However, not everyone shared that opinion. Candace Lively, the deputy solicitor for Chester County, voiced frustration that the sheriff had too quickly classified the case as an accident, arguing that certain aspects required closer examination to uncover the truth. Candace highlighted multiple inconsistencies in James's account. For instance, she noted that if Judy had been ejected from the vehicle, her injuries should have involved broken arms or dislocated shoulders. Instead, she suffered no injuries other than those to her head. Additionally, there was no visible damage to the windshield or the dashboard, which raised doubts about the assertion that she had been thrown from the car. When investigators questioned James more thoroughly, they found contradictions in his narrative. He said that he was driving Judy to a hospital located 30 minutes away instead of a closer facility, explaining that she did not like the nearby hospital. Throughout the interview, James showed little emotion, which increased the officers' suspicions. During the autopsy, medical professionals determined that Judy had sustained a large skull fracture measuring approximately 9 inches, extending from the back of her head to the sides. Such an extensive injury would have been unlikely to result from falling off a ladder onto a fireplace. Furthermore, the injuries present on Judy's body did not align with those typically caused by a fall, and the blood spatter inside the house was inconsistent with trauma described as accidental. The skull fracture also indicated that Judy would not have been able to speak during the drive to the hospital, which conflicted with James's statements. The autopsy ultimately determined that Judy died due to severe blood loss, a fractured skull, and blunt force trauma inflicted by an object. As investigators spoke with friends and relatives of James and Judy, they learned that the couple's home life was not as content as James had suggested. Conditions worsened as the pair frequently argued, and even family members acknowledged that James had difficulty controlling his anger. Friends believed that James was involved in an affair with a woman named Terry King, which offered an additional possible motive. However, James rejected all allegations and insisted that no serious problems existed, while Terry also denied being part of an affair. Doubts among Judy's relatives and friends intensified even more when, less than 2 months after the accident, James moved in with Terry. Surrounded by questions and inconsistencies, the deputy solicitor of Chester County chose to continue investigating Judy's death, even though the Chester County Sheriff had already closed the case. In January 2017, the State Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, assumed control of the investigation. SLED determined that Judy could not have been conscious and speaking with James throughout the drive, as he had asserted, because she had sustained a head injury. Investigators also learned that several months before the incident, James had bought an accidental death insurance policy, listing Judy as the insured and himself as the sole beneficiary for $25,000, which further raised concerns about his intentions. The SLED investigation also uncovered a series of messages exchanged between James and Terry, indicating that their relationship went beyond friendship and may have been romantic. Additionally, SLED identified irregularities at the crash site, including tire marks that suggested James still had control of the vehicle when the incident happened. In August 2018, authorities arrested James for allegedly killing Judy and staging the car accident to conceal the crime. James, who had worked as a police officer with the York and Columbia Police Departments and as a dispatcher for the Chester County Sheriff's Office, was suspected of using his professional experience to plan the offense. According to investigators and prosecutors during the trial, James relied on his knowledge to create a false crime scene designed to make Judy's death appear accidental. One of the most crucial elements of the investigation involved data recovered from the airbag module in James's Jeep. The information showed that no event severe enough to activate the airbags had occurred, even though such devices would normally deploy in a serious crash like the one James described. Investigators concluded that there had been no sudden swerve to avoid another vehicle and no impact strong enough to cause James to lose consciousness. His description of the accident conflicted with the physical evidence, leading investigators to determine that the incident he recounted never took place. In February 2017, law enforcement officers searched James's home for further evidence. Although the house had been cleaned, investigators located blood stains. These stains indicated that Judy had been murdered because their position was too high above the Christmas tree, making it unlikely that her injuries resulted from a fall. Instead, the blood appeared to have been splattered during an assault. 1 month later, prosecutors and investigators reviewed the evidence again and concluded that a stocking filled with Christmas gifts may have been the murder weapon. This item had been collected as evidence on the night of Judy's death. A forensic pathologist determined that the physical features of the stocking were consistent with the injuries found on Judy's head. The pathologist determined that the manner of death was homicide, which led the grand jury to indict James for the murder of his wife. James's trial started in October 2019, more than a year after his arrest in connection with Judy's killing. During the proceedings, Chester County prosecutors argued that the Chester County Sheriff's Office had failed to properly investigate Judy's death as a homicide. The trial continued for more than a week, and on November 5, 2019, the jury found James guilty of murder. According to prosecutors, on the night of December 14, 2016, James struck Judy, causing a fracture to her skull. He then placed her in his Jeep and deliberately drove into a creek to make her death seem like the result of a car accident. However, James's defense lawyers contended that Judy suffered her head injury after falling while decorating the Christmas tree, and that the vehicle accident happened as James was driving her to the hospital. When questioned about whether anything had occurred at the house that night, James insisted that he would never harm his wife. In spite of his repeated assertions of innocence, James Jamie Harold Baldwin was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole by Judge Dan Hall. Before this, in 2017, James had also been arrested in York County on allegations of arson and insurance fraud, but those charges were dismissed in 2020 after his murder conviction. In December 2022, the South Carolina Court of Appeals affirmed James's murder conviction. James had claimed that the presentation of a Facebook photograph showing him alongside former Chester County Sheriff Alex Underwood to the jury during the 2019 trial was prejudicial and should not have been allowed. However, the appellate court ruled that although the trial court had made an error by admitting the unrelated photograph, the mistake was harmless and did not influence the ultimate verdict. As of July 6, 2024, James remains imprisoned within the South Carolina Department of Corrections and is not eligible for parole. Moving on to the next case. The heartbreaking case of a beautiful woman, Julie Scully. Julie Marie Scully, an American woman, abandoned everything in pursuit of love, yet only a few months later, her body was discovered in a horrific condition in a secluded lake in Turkey. What transformed her once beautiful life into an international sensational case? Let us follow the case today. Julie was the daughter of Julia and John Scully. To better understand her story, it is important to look at her parents' circumstances. Julia was born in 1943 on an Indian reservation in New Mexico, which was home to the second-largest Native American tribe in the United States. Life on the reservation was extremely difficult, with no electricity or running water and very limited employment opportunities because of widespread alcoholism. Many residents resorted to substance abuse as a way to cope. When Julia was 12 years old, her parents sent her to a boarding school so she could learn English and adjust to life beyond the reservation. After relocating to the city, she began blending in as an average American and found employment at a mental health facility. However, she developed a substance addiction. Later, Julia met a police officer named John. They married just 2 days before the 1-year anniversary of their first meeting. John accepted a position as a patrolman in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in North Philadelphia. On January 1, 1969, Julia became pregnant, and they welcomed their daughter, Julie. As Julie grew older, she developed a very close relationship with her father, and relatives observed that she would do anything to gain his approval. Father and daughter spent a great deal of time together fishing, while Julia often felt pushed aside within the family. During this period, she struggled with feelings of being an outsider. Although Julia concealed her substance addiction, her erratic behavior caused concern among those around her. The situation worsened as Julia began using stronger illegal substances. Despite this, on November 10, 1969, Julie's brother, John Patrick Scully, was born. The newborn quickly became the focus of their parents' attention, leaving Julie feeling unloved and ignored. Meanwhile, Julia's substance abuse persisted, and she sank into deep depression. In 1973, feeling overwhelmed, she consumed an entire package of sleeping pills. Fortunately, John found her in time, administered first aid, and called for medical assistance. Julia was revived, but not only did the family become aware of her addiction, the situation continued to deteriorate. She began to resemble only a shell of her former self. Shortly afterward, Julia attempted to harm herself again due to depression, but she was saved once more. The problems between her parents did not go unnoticed by their children, especially by Julie, who was 9 years old at the time. During her birthday party, friends gathered to celebrate, but in the middle of the event, their father left to visit his mistress. He had been having an affair for some time, seeing it as an escape from his growing disgust toward his dependent wife. He stayed with Julia only for the sake of the children. During the party, the mistress arrived at their home to pick up John, and Julie saw her leaving with him. He appeared completely unconcerned that his secret was now exposed. This revelation deeply affected Julie, and Julia began blaming herself for the situation. Julia struggled to comprehend what was truly happening. During this period, Julie, who had once been an excellent student, began to fall to a C average at school. John then chose to transfer her to a new school in Kensington. There, Julie, a bright and attractive girl, became very popular but also fell in with a bad crowd. She started skipping school, and her grades continued to decline. By this time, she was 12 years old and already looked attractive, drawing the attention of many boys. All of this was worsened by the fact that the family lived in a disadvantaged neighborhood, which made her parents increasingly fearful for Julie. Worried that she might fall victim to addiction, one evening when Julie's friends were supposed to stay over, her mother went to check on them. However, the schoolgirls were not in the room. Alarmed, Julia contacted emergency services, and police eventually located them in downtown Philadelphia. Julie's relationship with her mother continued to decline, leading to frequent arguments. Her rebellious behavior also troubled her father. Julia entered treatment for her addiction. During Julia's absence, the atmosphere in the home became calmer. However, despite Julie's early attempts to please her father, her rebellious nature intensified. She continued to skip classes and perform poorly academically due to spending more time with friends. When John learned of this, he was very upset. At the age of 14, Julie informed her father that she wanted to drop out of school. This decision likely stemmed from her feeling ignored by her parents. She was attractive and often the center of attention at parties, making her prioritize fun over her father's approval. By the age of 14, Julie had started living a sexual life. After graduating from high school, her parents began considering her future and special education needs. John helped her gain admission to a prestigious engineering school known for its strict selection process. He personally spoke to the director to ensure she would be accepted without facing competition, emphasizing that she was the daughter of an indigenous person, which he hoped would earn her some concessions. In the fall of 1983, his efforts succeeded and Julie enrolled in the engineering program. Meanwhile, her brother chose a different path. He joined the Navy as soon as he turned 16. During this time, Julie decided she was content with her life and dropped out of school to pursue financial independence. She began working and soon met a boyfriend. He was 6 years older than her. Their relationship moved forward rapidly, and they married in November 1985, only a few months before Julie turned 18. Although marriage gave her financial support and emotional security, their union was kept hidden, even from her father. When John eventually learned about it, he supported the marriage, believing it was a better option for Julie than living with a dependent parent. Unfortunately, the marriage ended in 1988, and Julie had to move back in with her mother. Despite finding a new job, she did not contribute to her mother's expenses. Julie became more beautiful than ever, drawing attention whenever she appeared in public. Many people even mistook her for a model and often asked whether she was one. Over time, she began to make use of her beauty. Although she felt fragile and vulnerable on the inside, she was desperately searching for love but found only short-lived connections. Many men invited her out on dates and to different events. This pattern continued in July 1989, when she attended a fashionable party at a yacht owners' club. There, she met Timothy "Tim" Nist, a man who was 11 years older than her. He was a successful businessman who owned his own yacht. In the early 1980s, he started a landscape design company, and his business thrived during the boom of the U.S. real estate market. Julie and Tim's relationship progressed quickly, but it soon became clear that Julie was extremely jealous. One day, when Tim was at a bar with another woman, Julie arrived and immediately struck him, leaving a bruise on his face. She also attacked the woman, who was actually Tim's longtime secretary and simply an employee assisting with the business. Although the situation was tense, the conflict was eventually resolved. Julie dreamed of becoming a model and noticed an advertisement for a beauty contest in a newspaper. Eager to take part, she and Tim gathered her best photos to submit them to the magazine hosting the contest. Unfortunately, they later discovered that the contest was a scam. The magazine used fake advertisements to collect free photos for their men's section, which appeared on the last page. One day, Tim arrived at his office to find his secretary missing. To his surprise, Julie was sitting at her desk with a friendly smile, claiming that the secretary would no longer return to work and that Julie had taken over her position. This arrangement allowed Julie to work from home, giving her greater freedom and financial independence. Meanwhile, she kept checking her email to see whether another magazine had replied to the beauty pageant, but there was no response at all, which made her very frustrated. Eventually, feeling cheated out of her prize, she went to a magazine's office and confronted the editor, demanding an explanation for the lack of recognition for her supposed win. In the end, the editor accepted her photos and promised to include them in the next issue. Julie told everyone about what had happened and began preparing for the competition, which later took place in an elite hotel. At the contest, 12 finalists participated, including Julie. Unfortunately, the judges chose other contestants, and only one person voted for her. Despite this disappointment, Julie formed a friendship with Cheryl Chupless Hood, the magazine editor, and became the face of the magazine, appearing on billboards throughout the city. This exposure increased her popularity, leading to numerous modeling job offers. Julie quickly rose to fame, and her career flourished until the fall of 1990. She continued working for SEMA while winning awards in smaller beauty competitions. However, setbacks awaited her on the larger stage. On November 16, 1991, Julie married Tim at the age of 23. They lived a comfortable life and denied themselves nothing until 1997. Julie's modeling career kept advancing, resulting in higher income and appearances on television. However, she also began to struggle with alcohol abuse. Their marriage experienced highs and lows, but overall, they shared affection and understanding. Tim wanted children, and they had the financial resources to support a family. Julie, however, was reluctant, fearing it could threaten her modeling career. In February 1995, she became pregnant. Despite her friends' worries, she continued drinking and smoking during this period. On November 26, 1996, she gave birth to a daughter named Katie, an event that deeply changed her life, a change Julie willingly embraced. During this time, Julia overcame her addictions and began actively supporting her granddaughter. However, they often argued about parenting. Soon afterward, Julie began struggling with postpartum depression, feeling unhappy because pregnancy had affected her body. She became withdrawn and made no effort to return to her former self. Around the same time, her relationship with Tim started to decline, especially in April of that year. They were required to see a family psychologist. Julie felt the therapist favored Tim, but the therapist was actually trying to help her face her problems and past trauma. Ultimately, the psychologist concluded that Tim was not spending enough time with Julie, placing their marriage in danger. Julie felt lonely and began reaching out to friends. She came home intoxicated on November 1st. This marked the 7th year of Tim's annual cruise tradition, which they had followed since their wedding. That year, they decided to move the trip earlier to celebrate the Christmas holidays. The cruise was meant to strengthen Julie and Tim's relationship. They left Katie with her grandparents and flew to San Juan, Puerto Rico, where they boarded a cruise ship. Almost immediately, a man named George Skiatopoulos, who worked in the ship's engineering department, noticed Julie. Although he held a low-ranking job, he introduced himself as the captain. The following day, he made a bet with a friend that he could begin a romantic relationship with Julie. At just 22 years old and newly graduated from college, George was at the start of his engineering career, but he appeared respectable enough for Julie to believe him. He falsely claimed to be 28 and invented several achievements to impress her. At that time, Julie was 29 years old, and she quickly grew close to George. Tim noticed their interactions, but was used to Julie being friendly with strangers, so he did not think much of it and felt no jealousy. Before a party, George offered Julie a tour of the engine room. During the tour, they shared a kiss, but nothing more happened afterward. When Julie returned home, she excitedly told a family friend about her feelings, thinking it was only a brief attraction since she believed she would never see George again. However, not long afterward, George sent Julie a seemingly harmless letter, and they began speaking on the phone every day. He tried to convince her that Tim was not good enough for her. These conversations were not hidden from Tim. He caught Julie on the phone several times, but chose to trust her without questioning what they talked about. This situation left Julie feeling torn. She was divided between the stability of her family and the new emotions she felt with a young lover she missed deeply, which caused her to become more distant from her husband and daughter. Noticing the shift in her behavior, Tim became worried and wanted to repair their relationship. On January 3, 1997, he organized a surprise party for her 30th birthday. The celebration went well, with many friends in attendance. During the party, Julie asked for another cruise as a gift, naming a specific ship and date. Tim did not know about her real intention to meet George again. He agreed to her request. On February 13th, Julie went on a cruise where she met George. After sharing intimate moments and returning home, Julie excitedly told her friend Tony about the experience, who was also Katie's godfather. Although he was reliable, it was difficult for Tony to keep this secret. Feeling a strong yearning for George, Julie decided to visit him in secret. She presented the trip as a vacation with her mother and daughter. She disclosed her secret relationship to her mother, which resulted in disapproval. However, this did not stop Julie. At first, the plan was for Julia, and Katie to travel to Florida together. However, by March 26th, she left them behind and went to Puerto Rico, where she betrayed her husband's love. After returning, Julie began communicating more openly with George. She often spoke with him on the phone, sent flirtatious love emails, and even made a video showing moments of her life. She did all of this without concealing it from Tim, with whom she was still living. Using her husband's income, she began attending parties and drinking regularly. Tim noticed these changes and suggested they see a family psychologist after 7 years of marriage. One day, Julie stated that she wanted to separate from Tim, but he resisted the idea. She owned a share of Tim's business, which generated about $1 million a year. Julie was in serious need of money because George was planning to complete military service, which in Greece lasts 20 months. She tried to help George obtain a visa to the United States, but by that time, she could no longer afford it. Struggling emotionally, she began taking antidepressants, which made George very angry, and he forbade her from continuing the medication. To impress her new boyfriend, Julie decided to get back in shape. However, she had difficulty sleeping because she was taking sleeping pills and other strong medications, which caused her to lose about 10 kilograms. She hoped to return to modeling to earn money, but George was very jealous and opposed her continuing this career. As a result, Julie had to give up her plans. No one supported her relationship with this Greek man, not even Cheryl, who had previously shown interest in her. In a separate incident, Tim was unable to access a project document when Julie refused to let him enter her room, and he had to call the police for assistance. Despite her resistance, he retrieved what he needed for work. Julie became paranoid, believing that Tim had hired a detective to spy on her. Tension in their home increased, and it appeared inevitable that they were heading toward divorce. By midsummer, George and Julie secretly became engaged while they were in the United States. This was done in secrecy, although she did not hide from anyone that she intended to move to Greece. During this period, Tim began receiving monthly bills of $67 for international phone calls. Eventually, he discovered that she had been unfaithful to him with an engineer from a cruise ship, and that she had been communicating with him behind his back. This discovery enraged Tim, and he decided to speed up the divorce process to avoid complications. In response, Julie attempted to limit Tim's contact with Katie. She sought full custody so she could leave for another country without obstacles, which Tim strongly opposed. While they were trying to settle their issues, Julie's lover, George, told her that he had quit his job and planned to visit her in New Jersey. During this time, Julie was under intense stress because of ongoing conflicts with Tim, which even caused her hair to begin falling out. However, she believed all of this was due to being separated from her beloved. In addition, she became increasingly paranoid and jealous, demanding constant communication and obsessing over other women in George's life. When George arrived in New Jersey, their relationship became more chaotic. He frequently asked Julie for money, pressuring her to spend more than she could afford. Because of this, she was compelled to take money from Tim while entirely restricting his contact with their daughter. Tim went weeks without seeing Katie, which drove him to frustration. Meanwhile, George continually lied to Julie about his financial situation and employment status. It was astonishing how unattractive this man was, while the beautiful Julie, seemingly worshiping him, was willing to give up her well-established life for him. Julie's friends and family were baffled by her behavior. They tried to persuade her to reconsider her feelings, as they could not understand why she would fall for a bald, unemployed man with rotten teeth who was manipulative, deceitful, and excessively jealous. Despite their concerns, Julie appeared infatuated with him. She planned to use her divorce settlement to pay for a professional hair transplant for her boyfriend and to fix her own teeth. When Tim learned of her plans, he was furious, particularly because he felt Julie was involving Katie in the situation. He warned her that if she attempted to leave, he would take Katie away, and she would never see their child again. This threat likely dampened Julie's enthusiasm temporarily. She even told her friends that she had ended her relationship with George. However, this was only a brief setback. A few weeks later, she traveled to Greece with George to further their relationship. During this time, Julie met George's parents, and they enjoyed a weekend together. Due to the religious beliefs of George's parents, Julie had to conceal her marriage, her daughter, and her modeling past. When she returned home, she fantasized about a future with her lover. On December 1st, she planned to leave Tim and their shared home. That day, she also left Katie and checked into a hotel. After consuming a significant amount of psychoactive drugs, Julie traveled to Greece on December 8, 1998. While there, she and George made plans for marriage and their life together. George persuaded her to open a joint bank account, claiming it would help her navigate the language barrier. In her infatuation, Julie deposited $80,000 into the account and left an additional $18,000 in cash for expenses. This was all the money she had, and then she vanished without a trace. On January 8th, George called Julie's friend to report that she was missing. He said she was supposed to meet him near McDonald's for a snack, but never arrived, despite his waiting for several hours. At that time, they did not have mobile phones to contact her. After an extended search, George contacted the police to report his fiancée's disappearance. Shortly before these events, Julie had called her friend to express how much she missed Katie and to share that she was having problems with George. The friend sensed that Julie was contemplating leaving George and thought she would soon return to the United States. However, Julie never came back. Meanwhile, George's call raised suspicion. He told her friend that Julie had disappeared and left her passport in the car, which the police later took. The problem was that George could not locate the officer who had taken the document, making his story appear suspicious. In response, the friend contacted Tim, who was the only person able to help. Tim quickly realized that Julie was in serious trouble. The last time she had reached out to her family in the U.S. was on January 7th, and since then, no one had heard from her. Julie's mother described George as pathetic, not only unattractive, but also lacking self-control. There was an incident in which George became aggressive toward Julie when, during an argument with Julie, he yelled at her, grabbed her by the throat, and pushed her against the wall. He only let her go when he heard the threat of police involvement. At that moment, Julia attempted to end the relationship. Following this, Julia called the police and George was deported. Yet, despite the circumstances, Julie traveled to Greece to support her boyfriend. She defended him in every possible way, even taking responsibility for the attack. When she discovered that Julie was missing, Julia suspected that her daughter's boyfriend was involved in her disappearance. George pretended to assist with the search for Julie. During this period, Julie's family tried to contact the American embassy in Athens, but they faced a significant language barrier since no one at the Greek police stations involved in the investigation spoke English. In the United States, the FBI became involved in the case. It was revealed that Julie's passport had been with George the entire time, although he claimed he found it later. When George learned that the FBI was now investigating, he changed his story and said that Julie's documents had been stolen. His behavior grew increasingly suspicious. He attempted to withdraw money from their joint account, but was unsuccessful. The couple was scheduled to marry on January 23, 1999. During this period, news outlets were reporting on the missing American woman. George became agitated when he spoke on the phone with Julie's friend, who had alerted the media, George insisting he was innocent. He even gave statements to the press and participated in interviews to defend himself. 16 days later, George, the main suspect, was in the interrogation room. He continued to adhere to the story he had shared with the media. However, after 4 hours of questioning, the police got him to confess to killing his lover. He claimed it was an accident. George seemed to genuinely regret the incident, even shedding tears during the interrogation. Despite this, his account was full of inconsistencies. At times, he insisted that Julie had not disappeared, only to later admit his guilt and then deny any involvement again. George explained that after moving to Greece, Julie quickly became unhappy and missed her home. She expressed a strong desire to return, and despite George's attempts to support her, her distress only deepened, which worried him. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Julie was constantly in tears. Furthermore, George's mother discovered that Julie had an ex-husband and a daughter in America, which made her feel disgusted with Julie. She openly expressed her disapproval to George. He was ultimately persuaded by his mother to leave Julie with such a complicated past. Their relationship was full of arguments, and they eventually were evicted from their hotel due to their conflicts. However, George worsened the situation. He prevented her from contacting her family and friends and physically abused her. It became evident that his mother struggled with schizophrenia and frequently required hospitalization, and many of her issues seemed to have been passed down to George, who had an inflated sense of self-worth. Consequently, he exhibited arrogant behavior. His manipulative tendencies were often noticed by friends and family. He disappeared at the slightest disagreement and immediately attacked his beloved. Moreover, there was an incident in which George's mother herself had a badly injured hand. But she justified herself by saying that she accidentally cut herself. Despite the abuse, Julie remained in the relationship. On January 8, 1999, the couple embarked on a long trip to Athens. As they drove along a deserted two-lane highway, their calm conversation escalated into another argument. George eventually stopped in a remote area of the road where they were isolated from other drivers. George got out of the car and immediately attacked Julie, choking her in an attempt to silence her screams. George later told the police that it felt as if he were observing the incident from outside his own body. He felt completely powerless and could not stop until Julie showed no signs of life. Although he claimed the attack lasted only a few seconds, forensic experts indicated that strangulation typically takes at least 3 minutes. Afterwards, George was in shock and contemplated burning her body and scattering the ashes into the sea from a cliff, intending to jump afterward to be with her. However, he ultimately abandoned this plan. Instead, he found himself in an interrogation room, which revealed his guilt. George claimed he had attempted to take his own life using an air gun, jumping in front of a truck, and through an overdose of medication. But he was unsuccessful. Following the murder, he treated her body with indifference. He placed her in the trunk of his car and drove to the nearest gas station, where he purchased gasoline. He then returned to the scene, dragged her body away from the road near 2 small lakes, poured gasoline on her, and attempted to set her on fire. However, the fire did not ignite because it began to rain. At one point, he considered throwing her body into the lake, but instead placed the charred remains back in the trunk and drove to his grandmother's house. George discovered a large suitcase intended for travel and decided to pack the body inside it. By this time, rigor mortis had already set in and the body would not bend. Additionally, the head would not fit into the suitcase, so George resorted to cutting it off. He grabbed the head by the hair and raised it to the level of his face, and later confessed to the police that he was horrified by the sight of her vacant eyes. Yet he still found her beautiful. He kissed her on the lips before placing the body into the suitcase. Afterwards, he burned the suitcase and discarded it in a swamp, leaving the head behind. George then traveled to Kavala and threw Julie's head into the Aegean Sea. Tim and his family were informed of George's confession 19 days after Julie's disappearance. George, Julie's lover and intended husband, guided detectives to the murder site where they discovered her remains. Tim traveled to Greece to bring her body back to her homeland. During this period, George confessed to the crime on live television. His mother suffered a stroke upon learning of his actions. Tim's father even remarked that George should have died alongside Julie. Despite this, many articles unfairly blamed Julie for the tragedy. Greek authorities described this murder as one of the most horrific cases known at the time. George's lawyers attempted to argue that he was insane, citing his mother's schizophrenia as a possible reason for his mental state. At one point, George expressed a desire for the death penalty, but Greece does not have capital punishment. In the United States, Tim became a source of support for Julie's family and friends. Despite Julie's infidelity, he proved to be a decent person. Friends of Julie, who remembered her fondly, believed that George initially exploited her for financial gain. When he discovered that her husband was wealthy, he forced her to divorce for a tidy sum that the woman had to invest in his business. Before her death, Julie realized George's true intentions and decided not to invest in his projects, a decision that ultimately cost her life. George's trial began on November 27, 1999. Since 2009, cases in Greece have been heard by 3 judges instead of juries, which has expedited the justice process. Notably, no defense witnesses were present during the hearings. On December 6th, the court found George guilty and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Although it seemed that justice had been served, the Greek legal system faltered. In 2002, George appealed his conviction, claiming he was insane at the time of the murder. His sentence was subsequently reduced to 23 years, and he was granted the right to appeal again. By 2007, he was released and now lives with his new family in Kavala. The case of Julie Scully is a heartbreaking tragedy. With haunting details of the complex relationship, from a happy marriage, she began an affair with George Skiatopoulos, which led to irreparable arguments and conflicts that ultimately resulted in her death. The case is not only a story of personal loss, but also a reflection of the complex elements of love, trust, and power in relationships. The media and public continue to investigate to clarify what really happened, but the story of Julie will forever be a painful reminder of the tragic consequences of toxic relationships. Moving on to the next case. The case of Kristen Trickle. Kristen Trickle was born on August 14, 1993, in a small town in southeast Nebraska. Her childhood was neither particularly busy nor troubled. However, her biological mother abandoned the family when Kristen was not yet 3 years old. She left her husband and daughter for another man, moved to California, and never concerned herself with their fate again. Kristen's father, James, raised his daughter alone, doing his best to ensure she wanted for nothing. However, he contracted a serious illness that gradually worsened, and when Kristen turned 16, her father passed away. With no other close relatives, the girl could have been placed in a shelter until she reached adulthood. However, an aunt and uncle on her father's side, who lived in neighboring Kansas, intervened. Although they were raising 3 children of their own, they expressed a desire to adopt the orphaned girl and did their utmost to ensure she had a comfortable and happy life. Soon after, the girl moved into their family home. In her new family, Kristen never felt like an outsider. Instead, her aunt and uncle treated her like their own child, showering her with love and care. Kristen was a good student who participated in art activities, helped her family with housework, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian because of her love for animals. Family and friends described her as easygoing, kind, friendly, and very gentle. She was confident in pursuing her goals and spreading optimism to those around her. The Christensen family was very religious, attending church regularly on Sundays. It was here that 18-year-old Kristen met Colby, a young man who was an aspiring musician performing in a band that played music during sermons and prayer services. Colby, who had just turned 18, was very talented and dreamed of building a successful music career in the future. The two young people quickly developed a close relationship that later blossomed into romantic love. Colby was an excellent guitar player and composed his own songs, which he used to win the hearts of those around him. He was open, sociable, cheerful, and easy to befriend, often becoming the life of any gathering. After graduating from high school, he developed an interest in military affairs and decided to join the Army. At the age of 18, he signed several contracts and began serving in the United States Armed Forces. Over the next 3 years, he built a solid military career. Throughout this time, he maintained regular contact with Kristen, keeping in touch and corresponding frequently. At the age of 21, Colby abruptly enlisted in the reserves, returned home, and proposed to his sweetheart, who gladly accepted. They were married in April 2014. The newlywed couple settled in a small town in Kansas, where Colby completed college and pursued a music career, albeit without much success. He performed at small parties and local events, playing cover versions of popular songs. They had 2 dogs they adored, and many considered their marriage to be quite happy. However, after many years of marriage, a terrible tragedy occurred. On a gloomy Halloween night, October 31st, 2019, around 4 a.m., an emergency call was made to the police department. The caller, a man named Colby Trickle, reported that his wife, Kristen, had shot herself in the head with a revolver in their home. Paramedics and a nearby police cruiser were quickly dispatched to the scene. At the front door, Colby greeted the officers and allowed them inside, though he himself remained outside. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Colby remained calm. When the officers entered the bedroom, they found Kristen lying on the bed in a pool of her own blood. She had been shot with a large revolver, which lay on her stomach. Although she appeared dead, she surprisingly moved her arms, and an officer found a weak pulse and detected breathing. She was then moved to the next room and placed correctly on the floor for resuscitation efforts. However, despite these efforts, she was already dead by the time the ambulance arrived, and the medical team could only pronounce her deceased. Sergeant Brandon Hotman informed Colby that his wife had died. Colby repeatedly asked the officer to confirm the information. When the confirmation was given, Colby began to cry. However, Colby's behavior and tears did not appear sincere, as only minutes before Brandon arrived, Colby had been cheerfully talking with other patrol officers about video games. At first glance, It appeared that Kristen had taken her own life voluntarily. However, upon examining the scene, experienced detectives began to suspect foul play. It was Halloween night, and she seemed to have been actively preparing for the celebration. In the bedroom, on the dressing table, there were homemade costume decorations, and in the kitchen there were children's themed treats such as lollipops and ghost-shaped gummy bears. Her death was strange and did not resemble the typical way a woman might die. She was found almost naked, wearing only underwear. Women often want to look beautiful even after death and worry about how they will be found. Secondly, shooting oneself in the head was not a common method for women, again due to concerns about disfiguring their bodies. Kristen's face was so severely damaged that she had to be buried in a sealed coffin. The strangest and most revealing detail was that the pistol was too large and heavy for her small and fragile body. She would have struggled to hold it. Additionally, the position of the gun on her stomach and to the side puzzled the police. After realizing what had happened, Colby considered putting the gun to his own head. However, he ultimately abandoned the idea and chose to call emergency services, hoping to save his loved one. While law enforcement continued working at the scene, her cell phone lying on the nightstand suddenly rang. Kristen had apparently planned and prepared for the morning, but then changed her mind and decided to end her life that night. This raised suspicions, and detectives believed it might have been a carefully staged case. Colby, considered the main suspect, would soon be brought in for questioning. Colby agreed to go to the police station to give a statement. He appeared upset but not shattered, remaining calm and composed. He explained that his wife, Kristen, had returned from her management job at Walmart that evening, where she was hoping to be promoted to senior manager. After that, they played video games together. Colby then went to bed early because he was feeling unwell, while Kristen went into the kitchen to clean and prepare holiday sweets. In the middle of the night, Colby was awakened by a sudden loud bang. For a few moments, he was disoriented, his ears ringing, and he could not see anything in the darkness. When he turned on the light, he saw his wife lying motionless beside him, bleeding from her head. He tried to revive her, but realized it was pointless. He then held the pistol to his own head at first. But afterward he changed his mind, decided to place the gun on his wife's stomach, and eventually called emergency services and went outside to meet the police. His actions and behavior raised many questions. For example, why did he place the weapon on his wife's stomach instead of throwing it on the floor, the bed, or leaving it on the nightstand? It is also unclear why he waited outside for the police and paramedics if he believed his wife could still be saved. Normally, in such an emergency, people would attempt to provide first aid or apply pressure to the wound to stop the bleeding. When the police arrived, he did not go to his wife, stating that he was in shock. While a police officer was attempting to give first aid before the paramedics arrived, Colby did not seem concerned or ask about her condition. Instead, he casually spoke outside with a patrol officer about music and video games. When he was informed that Kristen had died, he tried to compose himself after shedding a few tears. At the police station, Colby was asked whether Kristen had life insurance. He responded that she did not, but added that he was entitled to some small payments from the armed forces where he had served. Colby then began to boast about his achievements, claiming that he had served in intelligence and taken part in special operations around the world. His explanation sounded convincing, but almost everything he said turned out to be inaccurate. When asked why his wife might have committed such a desperate act, he stated that she had suffered from symptoms of depression since childhood. Colby's statement sounded believable, and he spoke confidently and calmly. However, experienced investigators believed that he was lying and that he may have rehearsed what he would say. Nevertheless, they had no concrete evidence to charge him at that time, so Colby was released. When Kristen's relatives were informed of her tragic death, they quickly traveled to Hayes, 500 miles from where they lived, to meet with the police and arrange the funeral. They unanimously denied that she had taken her own life, citing her strong religious beliefs, regular church attendance, and the belief that such an act was sinful. According to her family, Kristen was an optimistic, life-loving person with ambitious plans for the future. She wanted to open a shelter for homeless animals and had been searching for an available property with a large plot of land that she planned to lease long-term for this purpose. Detectives also confirmed that she had been in negotiations to lease the property. She was expecting a promotion at work and took pride in her position. She was also preparing costumes and candy for Halloween and had promised to visit her sister on her birthday in mid-November. Her relatives insisted that she had never suffered from depression and had no mental disorders or harmful habits. Another important point they emphasized was that she would never abandon her dogs. In their conversations with the police, her aunt and uncle suggested that Colby may have treated his wife in a cold, staged manner to make it seem that she had voluntarily left this world. They described her husband as a cruel, domineering man who tried to control every aspect of her interactions, throwing tantrums if Kristen did not return his calls or messages immediately. Her husband had forced her not to speak with her family and to contact them secretly without telling him. Family visits were rare. During her last visit, she told her family that she could no longer tolerate the treatment and that if things did not improve, they would have to divorce. The results of the forensic examination and expert opinions after interviews with Colby and Kristen's family led detectives to believe that the forensic report would be critical to the case. The forensic report identified only one gunshot wound to the chin. The bullet was fired while she was lying on her back with the barrel of the gun pressed against her head. It is possible that she inflicted the wound herself, although it is highly unlikely that she did so. There were no signs of struggle or resistance on Kristen's body. However, after learning from relatives that Colby had been violent and controlling, detectives requested a further examination for any signs of bruising, abrasions, scratches, or other injuries in various stages of healing. They hypothesized that if he had occasionally abused his wife, there would be evidence of it. However, the investigation was disappointing, as no injuries were found on her body apart from the gunshot wound. During the investigation, authorities studied Colby thoroughly, including his personality. Through this, they discovered that Colby was a pathological liar. He had a habit of lying frequently and very convincingly, to the point that he seemed to believe his own lies. Colby provided false information about his musical achievements and income to those around him, even though he was not involved in intelligence activities or any hotspots, and he convinced everyone during the interrogation that he was telling the truth. Kristen, a hard worker, had been the main economic pillar of the family for many years. In contrast, Colby only earned income from occasional performances during the holidays, spending the rest of his time playing video games. Although Colby had real talent, he lacked perseverance and patience, and he was hindered by his own laziness. Police conducted a search of Kristen's phone and found a wealth of information. They discovered a phone calendar filled with everything from haircuts to meetings with a real estate agent. Additionally, Colby's text messages showed that he had openly flirted with another woman and exchanged messages even while at the police station. On the laptop in the living room, a search history from before the incident was recovered, showing that Colby had searched for life insurance benefits in the event of a loved one's death. This detail was particularly important to the authorities. The checks revealed that Colby had lied, as he had purchased 2 insurance policies for his wife, naming himself as the beneficiary in the event of her death. The contracts included insurance for his wife, along with a standard life insurance policy. The amounts involved were significant, contradicting his previous statements. He had even calculated exactly how much he would receive. Although the direct accusations from the victim's relatives were critical of Colby and suggested clear motives, the final decision still depended on the forensic expert's report. According to the documents, there were no signs of violence on the victim's body other than the gunshot wound, which suggested that the victim most likely ended her life voluntarily. The case was closed and archived. At that time, Colby had received compensation from the 2 insurance policies related to his wife. Specifically, he received nearly $50,000 from one special insurance policy and more than $100,000 from another life insurance policy. Once the money was deposited into his account, he purchased a lifelike doll from an online store. He also bought a new video game console, an electric guitar, and expensive musical equipment, and spent the rest on clothing and entertainment, especially frequenting bars and restaurants almost every night. Colby was enjoying life, not saving money, and believed the matter was over since there was no evidence against him and therefore no potential charges. He lived comfortably for about 2 years until a significant event occurred in the summer of 2021. A new prosecutor was appointed. The detectives in charge of the Kristen Trickle case asked the new prosecutor for assistance. They sought permission to reopen the investigation on the grounds that there was no doubt Colby had killed his wife. To prove Colby's guilt, the prosecutor presented unusual and telling evidence, including the suspect's web browsing history, which pointed to his clear actions and motives. After reviewing the relevant documents, the prosecutor decided to reopen the case, and Colby was arrested in July 2021. He was charged with first-degree manslaughter and willful obstruction of justice. While in custody, he remained calm and immediately contacted his attorneys, who began working on his defense. Colby's defense relied on the results of the medical examiner's report, which stated that Kristen had suffered from chronic depression for many years and that her tragic death was inevitable. During the trial, the attorneys attempted to portray their client as a loving husband, a brave soldier, and a person of good faith. However, without the results of the psychological autopsy, the investigation could have been weakened because it depended too heavily on the same medical findings. To help clarify the case and the investigation, the prosecution took a new step by bringing in experienced psychologists. They conducted a psychological analysis of the victim and investigated her emotional state immediately before the incident. This method is called a psychological autopsy or psychological exhumation. Psychiatrists conducted a comprehensive assessment of Kristen's situation, including analyzing data from her phone, social media posts, recent photographs, and interviews with relatives, friends, and colleagues. Although the process of collecting and analyzing this information took months, the experts concluded clearly that Kristen did not intend to end her life, as she still had both short-term and long-term plans. Legal proceedings related to this complex case were not initiated until September 2023, nearly 4 years after the incident. The defendant had clear motives, behaved suspiciously, and repeatedly lied during interrogation, but the initial conclusions of forensic experts were favorable to him. However, the prosecution now had another report that could potentially change the outcome of the case. When asked about the insurance claim web searches on his computer, Colby stated that it was possible his wife had filed a claim to receive payment. However, the timing of the searches contradicted his statement, as his wife was confirmed to be at work at the time, verified by the store's surveillance cameras. When asked about the life-size doll he had purchased even before burying his late wife, along with other expenses, he claimed that he could not sleep alone and needed someone to be with him. He explained that he had purchased several other items, such as a console and a guitar, to help cope with the sadness of losing his wife. The defendant's mother corroborated her son's testimony, vigorously defending him throughout the trial. The psychologist's conclusions about the victim's emotional state were crucial. This detailed assessment took time, but the results confirmed that Kristen did not intend to end her life. Important details regarding the bullet's angle were presented in the autopsy report. In court, the jury was shown the weapon used and the angle at which the bullet struck the victim's chin. Although Kristen was right-handed, the injuries suggested that she had either fired with her left hand or that a third person had held a gun to her head while she was asleep and fired. On November 20, 2023, the jury unanimously found Colby guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years. He has always denied his guilt, but all of his appeals have been denied. Notably, in this case, amendments to the medical report regarding the cause of death were never made. Moving on to the next case. Case of Norma Rodriguez. Norma Rodriguez was born on November 16, 1960, in the small town of Mercedes, Texas, which has a population of roughly 15,000 people. The town is situated near the southern border of the United States. Norma grew up in a household with 6 siblings, and they shared a strong bond. She was quiet and reserved, usually staying out of trouble. When Norma was around 12 years old, her family relocated to California, settling in the suburbs of Oxnard. The family hoped that the move would provide them with better opportunities. Life in California was fast-paced and stood in sharp contrast to the calm rural life they had known in Texas. Norma especially loved the beaches and the sunsets. After finishing high school in 1980, Norma decided to attend college in Oxnard, close to her family. There, she met Tony Rodriguez, a sophomore who became her first love. They dated for almost 2 years before getting married on March 6, 1981, when both were 21 years old. Later that same year, she gave birth to their first child, a son named Andrew. In 1989, they welcomed another son, Austin. However, in 1990 to 1991, Norma's marriage began to deteriorate. The couple argued more often, and Tony spent increasing amounts of time away from home on business trips. His frequent absences left Norma handling all the responsibilities of the household, the children, and work. She often confided in her childhood friend Teresa that although Tony did not have a problem with alcohol, he frequently lost control during arguments, sometimes becoming aggressive toward her and their eldest son. Norma did not want to be a single mother, but she realized that living with an aggressive man was becoming dangerous. After another incident, she and her 2 sons moved into an apartment just a 10-minute drive from Tony's home. Norma did not file for divorce, choosing instead to maintain a relationship with her husband to avoid hurting the children. Her apartment was located in Port Hueneme. Norma was particularly fond of the nearby park, where she enjoyed taking evening walks with her children. Neighbors described her as friendly but somewhat reserved, often keeping her distance from others so she could focus on her sons. After the separation, Norma worked extremely hard to support her children. Although she was exhausted, she found comfort in her sons. In March 1993, Norma began dating a mechanic named Daniel, who was also a coach in the junior league that her 11-year-old son Andrew participated in. They met at a party. The couple enjoyed spending time together, often walking in the local park, sometimes accompanied by her sons. Friends and family viewed the relationship as the happiness Norma had long been searching for. It appeared that she had finally found joy again after the painful separation from her husband. Even though everything seemed to be going well, Daniel announced that they were breaking up. The news came as a painful shock to Norma, who had not expected it. Daniel explained that he wanted to reconnect with his ex-girlfriend, whom he had recently gotten back together with. Norma was deeply hurt. To distract herself, she decided to host a barbecue at her home on Saturday, May 29, 1993. She invited guests, including her sisters and her friend Beatrice, hoping it would help her relax and enjoy the weekend. On Sunday, May 30th, she spent the day with her 4-year-old son Austin. They mostly watched television together, while Andrew was in Oxnard with his father. Andrew was scheduled to return home the following day. That evening, Norma received a call from Beatrice, who suggested going to the beach the next day. Since Norma had no other plans, she thought it would be a good way to forget about the painful breakup with Daniel. The next morning, police received a frantic call from Tony Rodriguez. He reported that he had found his ex-wife, Norma, dead in her home. Officers immediately went to Norma's house. When police arrived, they found Tony, his cousin Hector, and Norma's 2 sons waiting at the private entrance. Inside the living room, Norma was discovered lying on the floor. There were no visible injuries on her body. However, her head was tightly wrapped with tape. Police also observed that her clothes were unbuttoned. Her body was later sent for an autopsy. Investigators believed that Norma may have known her killer, as her face had been completely covered with opaque tape. This may have been done to stop her from seeing the face of her attacker. At the crime scene, there were no indications of a struggle or forced entry. Forensic specialists did not find any blood. The only object on the floor near the body was a set of house keys. Valuable items remained inside the house. The police dedicated all their efforts to the investigation. Specialists from nearby cities were called in, and forensic experts carefully examined the crime scene. However, they did not discover any useful evidence. Norma's sister, Auralia, tried to reach Norma that morning but could not get through, so she decided to go check on her. Auralia was shocked to see yellow tape surrounding Norma's house. Auralia later informed the police that Norma had a troubled relationship with Tony and that she had no other enemies. The police quickly focused on this information, knowing that Tony was the one who had reported the case. Tony was then asked to come to the police station for questioning. Tony behaved like a grieving husband, and although they had separated long before these events, he appeared to still have feelings for her. He stated that on June 1st, he went to Norma's apartment at around 7:30 a.m., as they had previously arranged. He was supposed to take the children to school, continuing the parenting routine they had established after their separation. Tony was accompanied by his brother Hector, who stayed outside in the pickup truck while Tony went to collect the children. He knocked on the door but received no response. Tony found the house unusually quiet, and no one answered his calls. He became increasingly concerned, fearing that something was wrong, but he did not have his own key to the apartment. He used his bank card to slide it between the door and the wall, managing to unlock it. Once inside, he called out to Norma but received no reply. In the living room, he found her body, noticing that her head was wrapped and her shorts were unbuttoned. Panicking, Tony ran outside to call his brother Hector. When they returned inside, the noise woke Austin, who came into the living room and found his mother unconscious. Austin was then quickly taken back to his room. Hector, after seeing the situation, touched Norma's body and felt that it was still warm. He rushed to get scissors from the truck and attempted to cut the tape covering Norma's nose and mouth, hoping she could breathe. After removing the tape, Hector realized that Norma was not breathing and had no pulse. In reality, Norma had been dead for some time, and Hector could not truly feel warmth, but he assumed this was due to shock and a natural reaction. Tony and Hector unintentionally destroyed a significant amount of evidence and contaminated shoe prints and DNA samples. The police suspected that Tony had a motive for the murder, as he had recently separated from Norma and was very unhappy about her new relationship. Additionally, there may have been disputes over child custody and child support, since the children were living with their mother. Norma's sisters reported that she was unhappy with Tony's frequent visits and constant attempts to control her. He claimed that his actions were driven by his desire to see and communicate with his children. However, according to Norma's relatives, he repeatedly asked to meet and hoped to repair the relationship, which only frustrated Norma and led to arguments. Hector and Tony were asked to take lie detector tests, which they agreed to and completed without issues. Initially, the police believed that these men were involved in the incident, but after the polygraph results were returned, they had to release them. The investigation then shifted its focus to other individuals close to Norma. After the autopsy, the medical examiner concluded that there was no evidence of sexual abuse. Although Norma's clothes were unbuttoned, this may have been an attempt to mislead the police. Norma's head had been wrapped with duct tape 14 times. Police gathered material from beneath Norma's fingernails and from the duct tape, believing that the killer's fingerprints might be present on these items. Unfortunately, the technology available in the 1990s did not permit thorough DNA analysis. Although all the collected evidence was preserved, it was unable to provide any useful information at that time. The police decided to interview the children. Andrew, the older son, stated that when his father brought him home on the evening of the 31st, he was also unable to reach his mother. However, he noticed that a window was open wide enough for him to enter the house. It was late, and he was surprised to find that his younger brother Austin was still awake. When Andrew asked why Austin was not sleeping, Austin replied that their mother was not feeling well and had a bandage on her head, so he was waiting for her to get better. Andrew assumed that his mother had simply fallen asleep, as she often rested in the living room. He put his younger brother to bed, and then lay down himself to avoid disturbing her. At first, the police believed that speaking with a 4-year-old might not produce helpful information. However, the child unexpectedly provided many details. He spoke to the police with a child psychologist present. According to Austin, that evening his mother opened the door to a man who introduced himself as Corey. The man had dark skin, and an argument broke out between them. Austin witnessed the stranger attack his mother and wrap duct tape around her head. 10 days later, Austin shared additional details. This time, he claimed that a light-skinned man named Warren had entered through the kitchen door and was responsible for wrapping duct tape around Norma's head. This confused the police, as there was no evidence suggesting that more than one person had been involved in Norma's attack. Ultimately, it was believed that interactions among family members after the murder may have distorted the child's memory. The police quickly identified the suspects as Corey and Warren. Norma's relatives were also aware of them. Norma had worked with both men for a long time and maintained friendly relationships with them. However, Corey Davis was not present at the party Norma had hosted. He lived about a 20-minute walk away. It was known that he had feelings for her and had asked her out several times, but she refused. After being rejected, he persisted and would appear at Norma's house without invitation. Norma did not have romantic feelings for Corey, but she was hesitant to reject him outright to avoid hurting him. Most witnesses described Corey as calm and kind. Although some people found him somewhat strange, Warren confirmed that he had attended the party hosted by Norma. He said that they talked until everyone else left, and that he watched television for a while before leaving around 10:30 p.m. The next day, he met friends in Santa Barbara. Warren denied any involvement in the murder and described his relationship with Norma as strictly platonic, insisting that he had no romantic interest in her. His friends later supported his account. Corey Davis, who worked with Norma, also denied having any romantic relationship with her, explaining that they only interacted at work. He stated that he was at home with his parents on the night of the murder. The police noticed that Corey appeared nervous during questioning and was unwilling to cooperate. Despite this behavior, there was nothing particularly suspicious that drew the police's attention. The officers then continued interviewing people close to Norma. Her friend Beatrice mentioned that during the barbecue before her death, Norma had expressed worry about misplacing her house keys. Interestingly, those keys were found next to her body when the police arrived. This detail appeared significant. The police decided to question Corey again and went to the address he had provided. They discovered that he had given a false address and actually lived somewhere else. The police then chose to administer lie detector tests to both Corey and Warren. To the surprise of the police, both men passed the lie detector tests without any issues. The case appeared to have reached a dead end. However, one more suspect remained on the list, Norma's ex-boyfriend, Daniel. He insisted that there was nothing amiss in their relationship, stating that he and Norma had broken up long ago but remained friends. He was now in a new relationship and had no conflicts with Norma. He denied any wrongdoing, and his alibi was verified. Daniel also successfully passed a lie detector test, leaving the investigation without any suspects. The police decided to review the case and speak again with Norma's friend Beatrice. This friend revealed that she had a close relationship with Norma. Beatrice disclosed that she had told Norma about an affair she was having behind her husband's back. Norma had allowed Beatrice to use her house to meet her lover, even giving her a key for easy access. This led the police to consider that Beatrice's husband might be seeking revenge, or that the lover could be involved. Now the police had two new suspects to investigate. They first spoke to Beatrice's husband, but he had a confirmed alibi. Police then interviewed Beatrice's lover, who was also quickly eliminated as a suspect. The situation became more serious when police discovered the body of a second victim 26 days after Norma's murder. The new victim was Beatrice Felice, an 87-year-old deaf-mute woman who was not a friend of Norma. She was found stabbed to death in her bed at a nursing home located a few blocks from Norma's apartment. A month later, on August 5th, 40-year-old Cynthia Berger was found dead in a burning house. After firefighters arrived, they discovered her body in the bathroom. Cynthia had been strangled and eventually died from smoke inhalation. This series of events shocked the police in the small town, which had never previously handled a major crime scene. 3 murders in quick succession suggested that a serial killer might be involved. The police were overwhelmed and needed to apprehend the killer immediately. Meanwhile, public pressure grew as locals held memorials to honor the victims and raise awareness of the tragedies. Since the town was unprepared for such a surge of crime, an FBI agent specializing in psychological profiling of criminals was brought in. In 1995, police received information about a man suspected of killing at least 5 women in the United States. The man was identified as Glenn Edward Rogers, 30 years old, whose previous crimes resembled the incidents in the local area. Glenn was later convicted of first-degree murder for the deaths of 2 women, one in Florida in 1997 and another in California in June 1999. After Glenn's arrest, he claimed he had been in California at the time of the crime. Violence in Port Hueneme ceased after the 3rd victim's death. The situation changed significantly in 2000 with the development of new forensic technology. By 2002, the DNA collected from the case was analyzed, but the police database showed no matches. However, in 2003, further analysis by a forensic scientist revealed a match. The DNA found under Norma's fingernails belonged to Warren Mackey, 39, a former co-worker of Norma. Although he had passed a polygraph test, a feat often possible for hardened criminals lacking emotion, Warren had lied about his plans on the night of the murder and even persuaded friends to support his false alibi. Police were astounded by Warren's ability to deceive others. On August 27, 2003, Warren Mackey was arrested for questioning. He was given one last opportunity to confess, but he continued to deny involvement and soon requested a lawyer, refusing further cooperation with the investigation. Warren was charged with murder. A preliminary hearing took place on March 2, 2004. The Supreme Court debated whether the case should be classified as first or second-degree murder. The matter was resolved on January 10, 2005, when Warren agreed to a plea deal with the prosecution and pled guilty to second-degree murder. In his confession, he stated that he had been under the influence of alcohol and drugs that night, which affected his memory of the events. Warren Mackey, then 40 years old, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As part of the agreement, he was not allowed to file any appeals. Soon after serving the required minimum time, he began requesting parole, but all of his applications were denied, largely due to the active involvement of Norma's family. 2 other murders that occurred around the same time were later determined to be unrelated to Warren. Moving on to the next case. The case of Pam Hupp. Pam Hupp was born on October 20, 1958, in Delwood, Missouri, as the second child of the Newman family. She married Mark Hupp, and together they had 2 children. In 2001, the family relocated to Fallon, Missouri. Pam had a diverse work history, including employment as a life administrator at State Farm until 2010, when she stopped working due to disability claims related to leg and back pain. Despite some prior legal issues, including 2 forgery charges, Pam's acquaintances never suspected her of being capable of murder. However, on August 16, 2016, Pam shot and killed Louis Gumpenberger, a mentally challenged man who had suffered physical and mental disabilities since a 2005 car accident. Pam claimed that Louis had attacked her with a knife after jumping from a passing vehicle, and that she defended herself by slapping the knife away before shooting him 5 times with her Ruger LCR, which she retrieved from her nightstand. However, this account appears suspicious, and what truly happened that day remains uncertain. Pam accused Louis of instructing her to drive him to the bank to withdraw money belonging to Russ Varia, a man wrongly convicted of murdering his wife Betsy in 2011. According to Pam, Louis became agitated and excited, saying, "We're going to the bank, we're getting Russ's money." Evidence later revealed that Louis's actual intention was for Gumpenberger to attack and kill Pam. A handwritten note found at the crime scene contained instructions for Gumpenberger. First, he was to take Russ's money from Pam's apartment. Next, he was to kill Pam and make it appear that Russ's wife was responsible. The note contained gruesome details, including leaving the knife protruding from Pam's neck. The perpetrator had offered Gumpenberger a large sum of money to carry out this heinous act. Pam Hupp was arrested for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger. However, questions arose. Was Gumpenberger acting as a hired assassin, or did Pam manipulate him, using a mentally disabled man as a scapegoat? The truth began to emerge when Pam voluntarily went to the O'Fallon Police Department. During her interview, she asked if it would be recorded, noting that she usually appeared with Chris Hayes, a KTVI News reporter. She even blamed Hayes for attracting criminals through his reporting. Pam had a history of pretending to be Kathy, a producer of an NBC TV show. According to the O'Fallon police chief and the St. Charles County prosecutor, Pam used this persona to lure Gumpenberger into her home, where she tricked him into recreating a 911 call, providing cover for the brutal crime she was about to commit. After killing Gumpenberger, Pam Hupp planted evidence to implicate herself, including writing a note found on his body. Police built a strong case against her due to the overwhelming evidence uncovered. They found $9 bills on Gumpenberger's body, which Pam had placed there. The 10th $9 bill was later found in her dresser, and its serial number matched 3 of the $100 bills also found on Gumpenberger. Pam Hupp was arrested on August 23, 2016, and charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. On the day of her arrest, when she requested to use the restroom, she attempted suicide by stabbing her wrist and neck with a ballpoint pen, but fortunately, she did not succeed. On January 30, 2017, she appeared in court for the first time. Prosecutor Phil Groyne argued that her actions demonstrated a consciousness of guilt. A grand jury convicted her on all charges. In December 2016, her bail had been set at $2 million. Pam's trial began in 2017, during which she pleaded not guilty, prompting the prosecutor to seek the death penalty. The reasoning was that Pam appeared to have chosen her victim, Gumpenberger, at random. In June 2019, Pam entered an Alford plea, which allowed her to plead guilty while maintaining her claim of innocence. This move nullified the death penalty charge and resulted in the cancellation of a jury trial. Consequently, Pam was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole in August 2019. Following her sentencing, she called her then-husband Matt Hupp and explained that she had confessed to killing Louis Gumpenberger to avoid subjecting their family to a lengthy and distressing trial. During the proceedings, disturbing details about Pam's past emerged, shocking the police, judges, and the public. In June 2016, Judge Cunningham ruled that evidence related to the brutal murder of Betsy Ferrier could be admitted in court. This decision led to the reopening of the Betsy Ferrier case. Betsy, born Elizabeth Ferrier, worked with Pam at State Farm as a life insurance administrator and lived in Troy, Missouri, with her husband Russ Ferrier and 2 daughters from a previous relationship. Betsy was diagnosed with cancer in 2010. In October 2011, she learned that the cancer had spread to her liver and that she had only a few months to live. Tragically, she passed away on December 22, 2011. Before her death, Betsy changed the beneficiary of her $150,000 life insurance policy from her husband to Pam Hupp, without informing her husband or daughters. Pam claimed that Betsy had instructed her to establish a trust fund for her daughters, but later alleged that Betsy wanted her to keep the money due to a romantic relationship between them. Betsy's daughters filed a lawsuit against Pam in 2014, attempting to reclaim their mother's life insurance proceeds. However, their case was dismissed in 2016. In the same year, Russ, Betsy's husband, sued State Farm. On December 27, 2011, just 5 days after making Pam the beneficiary of her life insurance policy, Betsy attended a chemotherapy session at the Alvin J. Siteman Cancer Center. Weakened from the treatment, she went to her mother's house, where it was arranged that Russ would either pick her up or she would stay overnight. Unexpectedly, Pam arrived and insisted on driving Betsy home. Claiming to have dropped her off around 7 p.m., Betsy's daughter reported that her mother did not answer her call at approximately 7:21 p.m. Later, at 9:40 p.m., Russ, Betsy's husband, desperately called 911, reporting that his wife had taken her own life. However, Russ had been at his friend Michael Corbin's house watching movies from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Afterwards, he drove to Arby's Lake in St. Louis before returning home. When emergency responders arrived roughly 10 minutes after Russ's call, they quickly determined that Betsy's death was not a suicide. Her body was discovered lying on her right side with 55 stab wounds and a deep cut on her wrist. A kitchen knife was lodged in her neck, and another knife was found beneath her pillow. Notably, no blood stains or footprints were observed around the house's entrance. The investigation determined that Betsy had died between 7:20 p.m. and 9:41 p.m. Suspicion immediately focused on Russ Ferrier, who became the prime suspect. Authorities believed he had a motive, as his wife had refused him access to the $150,000. Russ was arrested and charged with his wife's murder, while the actual killer remained free. Russ Ferrier was taken into custody the day after Betsy's death, becoming the main suspect due to his 911 call in which he claimed his wife's death was a suicide. However, a glance at the body immediately ruled out this possibility. Additionally, a pair of blood-stained slippers was found in his closet, providing incriminating evidence against him. Russ was subsequently charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action in January 2012, just 1 day after his wife's funeral. The investigation uncovered further damning evidence against Russ. He performed poorly on a polygraph test, causing police to consider his behavior suspicious and erratic. Furthermore, at Pam's request, police searched Betsy's laptop and discovered a disturbing Word document in which she expressed fear of losing her life at the hands of her husband. Russ was held on a $250,000 bail, which he could not afford, so he remained in county jail until his trial on November 18, 2013. During police questioning, Pam revealed that Russ had a history of violence, heavy drinking, and had previously threatened Betsy, making him an obvious suspect. The prosecution argued that Russ had a strong motive to kill his wife, as she had received $150,000 for her friend, bypassing him. According to Judge Christina Menem, this motive was sufficient to implicate Russ. At trial, Russ's lawyer, Joel Schwartz, defended his client's innocence, asserting that Russ had spent most of the night with friends who corroborated his alibi. Additionally, Russ had purchased food at a store that evening, making it physically impossible for him to stab his wife 55 times in the given time frame. Moreover, there were no bloodstains on his clothes or body. The prosecutor suggested that Russ's friends might have been involved in the crime and had lied about his whereabouts that night. It was claimed that his friends had accompanied him to buy food at Arby's and stage an alibi. Judge Christina Menem refused to allow Joel Schwartz to present critical evidence implicating Pam as an alternative suspect. This evidence included phone records showing Pam remained near Betsy's apartment 30 minutes after she claimed to have left, as well as the fact that Betsy had changed the beneficiary of her $150,000 life insurance policy just 5 days before her death. Despite Pam having a clear motive, the judge chose to ignore it. In a closed hearing, Pam claimed to have placed $100,000 of the insurance money into a trust fund for Betsy's daughters. However, in a later civil deposition, she admitted to keeping the money for herself, stating that she did not want her daughters, mother, or sisters to have it. Meanwhile, Detective Mike Merkel of the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office reported that a crime scene camera had malfunctioned, preventing important photographs from being developed. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Russ was convicted of first-degree murder and armed criminal action in November 2013. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for 30 years. Before Ferrier's second trial, Attorney Schwartz finally obtained the photos showing no blood trail. To this day, he has been unable to identify who in the prosecutor's office sent him those photos. Fox 2 News was present in the courtroom when Schwartz dramatically revealed that he had uncovered evidence the police and prosecutors had concealed. Afterward, Russ was transferred to the Jefferson City Correctional Center, a welcome development for Pam's sister Betsy. During the trial, Russ's wife testified that he had once pressed a pillow against her face, whispering, "This is what it feels like to die," because she had removed him from her insurance policy. Schwartz pointed out that this story had originally come from Pam, but the judge ignored it. Throughout the trial, Russ's friends were falsely accused of being accessories to murder due to the prosecutor's closing argument. Fortunately, no charges were brought against them, even though Russ spent nearly 4 years in prison. In February 2015, attorney Joel Schwartz appealed Russ's conviction. However, back in 2013, Judge Christina Menem had already denied Schwartz's request to review the case. In 2014, KTVI and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch revisited the case, uncovering suspicious facts about Betsy's death and her true killer. Their investigation found that Pam Hupp had given contradictory statements to police, including a false claim that she had left the Ferrier residence immediately after dropping Betsy off. The Ferrier murder case was marred by controversy and deceit. A police officer recalled being shocked that no one suspected Pam, with all attention focused on Russ. A 911 operator testified that Russ appeared genuinely shocked and agitated during their call. However, 2 jurors revealed that crucial information had been withheld from them, raising questions about why the sheriff's department would deliberately hide evidence that favored Russ. The media uncovered a troubling network of relationships between the prosecuting attorney, ASI, and key figures in the case, including the captain of investigations and a lead investigator. This information led to Russ's retrial in February 2015. The Missouri Court of Appeal transferred the case back to the 45th Circuit Court, where a new judge, Stephen R., assumed control. He granted a new bench trial due to new evidence and released Russ on bond pending the trial. During the retrial, Russ was permitted to present incriminating evidence against Pam. Some police officers admitted that Pam had told them she saw Russ with another man in a car while she was dropping off Betsy. The CSI agent who handled the crime scene believed that Russ's bloodstained slippers had been staged and that the bloodstain was not caused by stepping in blood. Russ was acquitted of all charges and released on November 7th. He later filed a lawsuit against ASI and 3 deputy sheriffs for ignoring exonerating evidence and fabricating evidence. In 2020, he was awarded a $2 million settlement. The case also led to consequences for the officials involved. ASI faced a bar complaint, although it was rejected. She later stated that she was willing to cooperate with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Lincoln County Commissioner to review her conduct. Judge Christina Menem was suspended for misconduct in a separate case and was voted out of office in 2018 due to her role in the Ferrier murder case. In 2019, Lincoln County appointed a new attorney, Mike Wood, who reopened the Betsy Ferrier murder case. He stated that Russ's wrongful conviction had inspired him to take the job. Pam was eventually interrogated as a suspect in the murder and was charged with first-degree murder. The new prosecutor, Wood, sought the death penalty due to the heinous nature of the crime. Betsy Ferrier had been brutally murdered, stabbed 55 times, with her wrist almost completely severed. Detective Wood condemned the actor's animalistic behavior and charged Pam Hupp with the crime. would possess strong evidence against Pam, including the $150,000 life insurance policy that named her as the beneficiary just days before Betsy's death. Pam had promised to place the money in a trust fund for Betsy's daughters, but instead kept it for herself, claiming that Betsy had wanted her to have it. In an interview, Pam asserted that she and Betsy were lovers, but would believed she was lying. Pam had also loaned her son $120,000 from her company in 2021, contradicting her earlier statements. Wood was convinced that Pam murdered Betsy by stabbing her with a kitchen knife while she slept on the sofa. He believed Pam tried to stage the scene to resemble a domestic violence incident by walking around the room in socks. The evidence against Pam included a text message she sent to Betsy's phone at 7:20 p.m., claiming she was home, while her call records showed she was still at the Ferrier residence. The fact that Betsy was found lying on her side suggested to Wood that she was killed by someone she trusted. Pam pleaded not guilty to the crime, but her trial was delayed multiple times due to her attorney's death and other complications. Finally, in 2023, the trial was scheduled to begin in 2025. Wood was determined not only to bring Pam to justice, but also criticized the Lincoln County prosecutors for mismanaging the case and showing bias against Russ Ferrier, Betsy's husband. He highlighted a 2015 destruction order that could have led to the loss of evidence, which would have made Russ's release from prison impossible. Moving on to the next case. The case of Stephen Freeman. Stephen Freeman was born on January 1, 1995, in Thomason, Georgia, to parents Troy and Jennifer Freeman. Alongside his brother Blake, Stephen enjoyed a happy and healthy childhood, free from problems with his parents or society. As a friendly and responsive person, he built strong relationships with many friends, who often described him as exceptionally calm. Growing up in Griffin, Stephen attended Spalding High School and later Gordon State College. Mary Catherine Higdon, his future partner, was known for her cheerful, humorous, and friendly personality. Mary expressed her creativity through performing numerous plays for family and neighbors. In their senior years, Mary and Stephen fell deeply in love and remained inseparable. Shared interests brought the couple closer together, as they often spent time in nature enjoying activities such as hiking, fishing, and hunting. After publicizing their relationship on Facebook in 2012, Stephen frequently posted photos with Mary. Both families were pleased with the young couple's relationship. Mary's family adored Stephen, and his parents welcomed Mary as a second daughter. Upon finishing school, Stephen and Mary moved in together. Stephen secured a job at Drain, Gutters, and Roofing Incorporated as a plumber, while Mary worked as a teacher's assistant at St. George's Episcopal School. She also worked part-time at a local gun store. By the summer of 2018, Stephen and Mary had been living together for 7 years. On August 1, 2018, at 10:42 p.m., Mary called emergency services in a panicked state. She claimed that she had unknowingly shot her boyfriend with a Glock 43 firearm, believing it to be unloaded. When paramedics and police arrived at their home on Sunnybrook Drive, Mary was in shock, kneeling beside Stephen's motionless body, crying and begging for help. She was eventually pulled aside by law enforcement officers, who examined Stephen and administered first aid despite his severe chest wound. Stephen was still breathing when paramedics arrived. Stephen, 23, was quickly transported to Spalding Regional Hospital, but his condition worsened, and his heart stopped just before midnight. Mary, still reeling from the incident, was required to give a statement at the police station. During questioning, she reiterated her claim that the shooting had been accidental. Mary explained that her home had always contained firearms, and that Stephen would leave a pistol on the nightstand at night for protection because they lived outside the city. On the evening in question, Mary claimed she had simply intended to hand Stephen the pistol, and it accidentally discharged. She stated that she had no knowledge the gun was loaded at the time. Mary emphasized that Stephen was the love of her life, and that she would never intentionally harm him. When investigators examined the scene, they found evidence suggesting the act might have been planned in advance. In the kitchen, signs of a struggle were visible, with food and dishes scattered about. Detectives Adam Trammell and Chris Wilson found it difficult to believe Mary's story and decided to investigate the evidence further. Mary was brought in for another interrogation. This time, the investigators applied pressure, raising their voices, expressing doubt about her account, and demanding honesty. The tactic succeeded, and she confessed to shooting her boyfriend in a fit of anger. She revealed that they had a severe argument that night and that she had wanted to leave him. Investigators recorded the conversation, capturing her admission of guilt and essentially resolving the case with a candid confession. A technical issue occurred, resulting in the loss of most of the recording, leaving only fragments of interference and indistinct noises. The cause of this technical failure was unknown, and it was surprising that no one had made a backup copy of such crucial evidence. Further investigation revealed that the pistol was not capable of accidental discharge, as it required a deliberate pull of the trigger. This meant the gun had to be intentionally aimed at Stephen for the bullet to strike him. Detectives also expressed skepticism regarding Mary's behavior and questioned whether her apparent distress was genuine or feigned. They continued to gather evidence, gradually reconstructing the sequence of events. However, Mary's own words raised another significant question about the claimed accident. Investigators discovered that she had previously worked at a gun store, where employees underwent extensive training in firearm safety before starting work. This strongly suggested that Mary should have known how to handle a pistol safely, making the possibility of an accident highly unlikely. The investigation into the incident revealed inconsistencies in her initial testimony. Mary gave multiple conflicting statements during questioning. Initially, she claimed Stephen's death was an accident, saying she was handing him the pistol when it discharged. Later, she suggested she had accidentally fired while tossing the gun to Stephen at his request. These contradictions raised suspicions, as her story changed repeatedly. As a result, Mary was detained at Spalding County Jail and charged with felony malice murder, aggravated assault, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Lieutenant Wilson strongly disputed Mary's claim of an accident, seeking to prove that she had deliberately planned the act. A recent discovery added to the case. A small amount of cooking grease was found on the pistol's slide, indicating that the gun had been handled recently, possibly removed from the shelf, reloaded, and replaced. Mary explained that she had been preparing dinner for Stephen that evening, which could account for the grease on the slide. Despite continued investigation, conversations with Mary, Stephen's family, and friends offered little additional clarity. It emerged that Mary and Stephen, who had begun dating as teenagers, had a complex and on-again, off-again relationship marked by repeated breakups and reconciliations. Their relationship was tumultuous, often involving heated arguments. Mary would sometimes escalate into screaming and physically lashing out at Stephen, prompting him to leave the house to stay with friends. During these times, Stephen would usually turn off his phone, while Mary continued to call and text him. Mary's behavior extended beyond verbal disputes. She often tried to control Stephen's actions, leaving him feeling frustrated and powerless. Furthermore, Stephen confided to friends that Mary had, on multiple occasions, brandished a pistol during fights, threatening either herself or him. Despite the seriousness of these incidents, Stephen chose not to report them to police, fearing that Mary would face jail time. A friend of Stephen's, Thomas Skinner, provided critical information during interrogation. He stated that just 2 days before the fatal incident, Stephen and Mary had exchanged affectionate messages, wishing each other a good day. However, the situation deteriorated the following day. Stephen told his mother that he did not want to return home due to the unbearable circumstances, saying he would rather stay with Thomas. On the night of August 1st, 2018, when Stephen failed to come home, Mary sent him hundreds of messages, desperately pleading for him to return. That evening, she prepared dinner, expecting Stephen to come home. When she learned from Stephen's mother that he was at Thomas's house, Mary drove to pick him up and encountered them on the road. She rolled down her window and told Stephen that she was waiting for him at home for dinner. Stephen agreed to return home, but the evening concluded in a tragic incident. A year following Stephen's death, Mary went on trial in June 2019. Prior to the trial, the prosecution presented Mary with a deal: life in prison with the possibility of parole if she admitted to committing the crime. Despite this offer, Mary rejected it and continued to assert her innocence. During the early court proceedings, Mary strongly defended herself. She insisted that the incident had been accidental and that she never intended to harm Stephen, highlighting her deep affection for him. She also made a startling claim, alleging that Stephen had a history of abusing her. According to Mary, he physically assaulted her on 2 separate occasions and even forced himself on her. On the day of the tragic event, Stephen allegedly attacked her, compelling her to defend herself. It became evident that the couple's relationship had been deteriorating for quite some time. Friends and family observed that Mary had been angry with Stephen for repeatedly ignoring her messages and calls. In the days leading up to the incident, Mary's behavior had grown increasingly demanding, and she had become very insistent on having her way. On the night of the shooting, Stephen returned home but refused to eat the dinner Mary had prepared for him. This rejection seemingly pushed her over the edge, prompting her to fire at him. Prosecutor Kate Leonard introduced evidence in court suggesting that Mary shot Stephen in a fit of anger when he returned home but declined the dinner she had made. Key evidence included grease found on the pistol and a sheet from the mattress where Stephen was discovered bleeding. Forensic examination of bloodstains on the bed sheets indicated that Stephen did not attack or approach Mary at the moment of the shooting. Instead, the findings suggested he was sitting calmly on the bed, motionless. Had he been moving, the blood stains would have been more dispersed, but they were confined to a single area of the sheet. Mary again faced the prospect of life imprisonment. She took the risky step of testifying honestly in court, her voice trembling with emotion and tears streaming down her face. In front of the judge, she portrayed Stephen as a controlling, violent man. She provided evidence supporting her account, asserting that she shot Stephen in self-defense following an argument on the night of the incident. Mary sorrowfully recounted many experiences from her life with Stephen. He subjected her to both physical and emotional abuse. She stated that Stephen frequently struck her violently and issued threats over minor mistakes or perceived disobedience. She was continually manipulated and controlled. Stephen monitored all aspects of her life, from her spending habits to her friendships and even her diet. His extreme possessiveness caused Mary intense anxiety and depression. Her combined feelings of love and fear toward Stephen made her reluctant to report his behavior to authorities. However, a review of text messages from Mary's old phone raised doubts about who was truly the abuser and manipulator in the relationship. These messages, covering an 18-month period, revealed Stephen's aggression but also exposed Mary's infidelity. While some messages contained harsh language and threats from Stephen, they frequently appeared as responses to his own pain and anger stemming from Mary's betrayals. Mary stated that Stephen had previously forced himself on her on 2 separate occasions. She feared he might harm her again on August 1, 2018, which led her to defend herself. To substantiate Mary's claim, the defense presented expert testimony and called close relatives, including her sister, Sarah Higdon. Mary's sister recounted seeing bruises on Mary's arm 2 weeks before the incident and expressed regret for not photographing them or taking action at the time. During her testimony, Mary conveyed her emotions as she described the events of that night. She had decided to end her relationship with Stephen and told him to leave, but he became angry and attacked her. In response, Mary took a pistol from her nightstand, which discharged accidentally. The prosecution and defense offered opposing viewpoints. The prosecution depicted Stephen as the victim, while the defense argued that Mary acted in self-defense. Stephen's friends sought to portray him positively, describing him as loyal and hardworking. They portrayed Mary as a possessive girlfriend who controlled Stephen and threatened self-harm whenever he attempted to leave the relationship. Thomas, one of Stephen's closest friends, claimed that Mary's behavior had become increasingly damaging and unacceptable over time. He asserted that she had even once pointed a pistol at her own head during an argument, implying that her actions were intended to maintain control over Stephen. Alicia Varela, a co-worker of Stephen, testified that Mary frequently called Stephen throughout the day, even when he was at work. However, during her court testimony, Mary omitted a critical detail, which prosecutor Kate Leonard highlighted. Mary described their relationship as deteriorating and claimed the shooting was in self-defense, but she did not specify the precise moment when she pulled the trigger. Prosecutor Kate Leonard challenged Mary's claims, noting that during cross-examination, Mary never referenced Stephen's alleged abuse. To reconstruct the shooting incident, Prosecutor Kate held the pistol and described the scene. According to Kate, Stephen returned home, and the couple argued over dinner. When Stephen refused to eat, Mary, in anger, threw the prepared food around the kitchen. Stephen then went to the bedroom to avoid further conflict, likely waiting for Mary to calm down. However, instead of calming, Mary called out to Stephen twice without receiving a response. She then entered the bedroom, where she shot Stephen in the left side of his neck. Kate Leonard concluded her argument by urging the jury to consider the inconsistencies in Mary's account, which had changed significantly after repeated interrogations. The prosecution introduced additional evidence to challenge Mary's version of events. Forensic analysis showed that Stephen was sitting on the bed at the time of the shooting, contradicting Mary's claim that he was attacking her. Mary asserted that the gun was usually kept unloaded in the house, but detectives suspected it might have been loaded in advance on the evening of August 1, 2018, when Mary was preparing a rope for Stephen. Supporting this theory, grease marks were found not only on the slide of the pistol, but also inside it, raising questions about whether Mary had loaded the gun before the incident. Everyone who knew Stephen testified that he was not an aggressive individual. However, prosecutors emphasized that Mary changed her story at least 10 times during the investigation, which she attributed to fear. She had previously declined a plea deal that could have spared her from the death penalty, and the prolonged wait for the verdict was excruciating for her. The jury found the arguments presented by jurors Victor and Chris persuasive. After hearing all witnesses and Mary herself, the jury deliberated and reached a unanimous decision. Mary Catherine Higdon was found not guilty on all charges. The jury's verdict shocked and outraged many in the courtroom, particularly Jennifer Freeman, Stephen's mother, who struggled to contain her anger as she watched the woman who killed her son walk free. They found it difficult to understand how the jury could reach such a conclusion. Following her acquittal, Mary returned to Griffin to be with her family. Since then, she has maintained a low profile, avoiding public exposure and media attention. Her social media presence is minimal, with her Instagram account set to private. Little is known about Mary's current life, and it is assumed that she has moved on from her difficult past to live a quiet, private life. Stephen's mother paid a heartfelt tribute to her son on social media. In his outgoing nature, he made friends with everyone he met, but those who shared his love for hunting and fishing held a special place in his heart. His kind nature, warm smile, and charm left a lasting impression on those around him. Stephen's way of expressing love was unique and special. He made people feel as though they were the only person in the world, bringing laughter and joy to those who spent time with him. His warm smile and welcoming hugs made everyone feel cherished and appreciated. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into cold case investigations. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video. And remember, the search for truth never stops.